Crimson Sunrise.
France, 1918.
Isabel Hartley crouched beside the fallen, listening to the silence between the distant gunfire. Then, right beside her ear, a whisper. Isabel. She turned. No one was there, but written in the mud beside her, in fresh, deep letters, was Samuel Hayes' name. Chapter 1. The Whisper in the Mud. The air hung thick and heavy, a suffocating blend of damp earth, cordite, and the ever-present, cloying sweetness of decay. Isabel Hartley knelt in the freshly churned mud of the trench, her fingers tracing the outline of a newly bandaged wound on a young soldier's arm. He winced, but his eyes, though dulled with pain and exhaustion, held a flicker of gratitude. He was barely more than a boy, really, his uniform ill-fitting, his face still holding the soft contours of youth, despite the grim realities etched into his young features. "There you are, son," Isabel murmured, her voice low and soothing, a practice balm against the constant roar of artillery that punctuated the eerie silences of the Western Front. "Try to keep it clean if you can." The absurdity of the statement hung in the air between them, a silent acknowledgement of the impossible conditions they endured. Cleanliness in this hellscape of mud and blood was a luxury no one could afford. The boy managed a weak smile.
"Thank you, ma'am."
He clutched his arm, his gaze drifting towards the parapet, beyond which lay the no-man's land, a desolate stretch of shattered earth and twisted wire that separated them from the enemy. Isabel followed his gaze. The late afternoon sun, a pale, watery disk, was struggling to pierce the perpetual gloom that clung to this corner of France. The air was growing colder, the dampness seeping into her bones, a familiar ache that mirrored the deeper, more persistent ache in her heart. It had been 4 years since she'd last seen a familiar friendly face, for years since she'd volunteered as a nurse, driven by a desperate need to escape the suffocating grief that had enveloped her after Thomas. She pushed the thought away, as she always did, forcing herself to focus on the present, on the immediate needs of the wounded. There was no room for personal sorrow in this place. Survival demanded a relentless focus, a deliberate numbing of the emotions. A sudden barrage of shells exploded nearby, shaking the ground and sending a shower of mud and debris raining down into the trench. Isabel instinctively ducked, shielding the young soldier with her body. The air filled with screams and the chaotic scramble of men seeking cover. The boy whimpered, his face buried in her shoulder. "It's all right," she whispered, her own heart hammering against her ribs. "It's all right." She held him tight, her gaze fixed on the rough-hewn wooden planks that lined the trench, willing the shelling to stop. When the barrage finally subsided, an unnatural silence descended, broken only by the ragged breathing of the men around her and the distant crackle of rifle fire. Isabel carefully eased the boy back, checking for any new injuries. He was pale and shaken, but otherwise unharmed. She rose to her feet, her muscles stiff and aching. The trench was a scene of controlled chaos. Men were patching up wounds, checking their rifles, and exchanging nervous glances. The air was thick with the smell of fear and adrenaline. Isabel moved down the trench, checking on other soldiers, offering what comfort and aid she could. Her hands were steady, her movements practiced, honed by years of experience. She had learned to compartmentalize, to shut out the horror, and focus on the task at hand. But beneath the surface, the constant strain was taking its toll. The nightmares were becoming more frequent, the memories more vivid. As she reached a relatively quiet section of the trench, she paused, leaning against the muddy wall, allowing herself a moment of respite. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to find a center of calm amidst the storm. That's when she heard it. A whisper, so faint she almost dismissed it as a trick of the wind. It seemed to come from right beside her ear, a breath of sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Isabel." Her eyes snapped open. She looked around, her heart pounding. The trench was deserted at this particular bend. There was no one near enough to have spoken. She scanned the faces of the men further down the line, but they were all preoccupied, their expressions grim and focused. Had she imagined it? The stress, the lack of sleep, the constant exposure to death and suffering. It was enough to make anyone hallucinate. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the unsettling feeling. She was about to move on when she noticed something in the mud at her feet. It was freshly disturbed, as if someone had knelt there recently. And there, etched into the damp earth, were two words, clear and distinct, written in a bold, unfamiliar hand: Samuel Hayes. The name struck her like a physical blow. A name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in years, a name that belonged to a past she had tried desperately to bury. A name that held both the sweetest of memories and the bitterest of betrayals. Samuel. Her childhood friend, her first love, the man who had vanished without a trace on the eve of the war, leaving her with nothing but a broken heart and a sea of unanswered questions. How could his name be here, in this godforsaken place, scrawled in the mud of a French trench? It was impossible. A cruel joke, perhaps? Or a sign that she was finally losing her mind? She stared at the name, her mind racing. Could it be him? Could Samuel be here, somewhere on the Western Front? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. It stirred up a whirlwind of emotions she had long suppressed: hope, fear, anger, and a lingering, undeniable tenderness. She knelt down, her fingers tracing the letters in the mud, as if to confirm their reality. The cold, damp earth seeped into her gloves, a chilling reminder of the harsh reality that surrounded her. A sudden shout from further down the trench broke her reverie. Stretcher bearers. We need stretcher bearers. The urgency in the voice snapped her back to the present. She had a duty to perform, wounded men to attend to. But the whisper, the name in the mud, it had planted a seed of doubt, a flicker of hope in the darkness. And she knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that she wouldn't be able to rest until she found out the truth. Chapter 2.
Ghosts of Amiens.
The rest of the day passed in a blur of blood, bandages, and the muffled cries of the wounded. Isabel moved through the field hospital, a converted church just behind the front lines, with a practiced efficiency that belied the turmoil raging within her. The whisper, the name in the mud, Samuel Hayes, it echoed in her mind, a persistent counterpoint to the cacophony of war. The church, once a place of peace and solace, was now a scene of organized chaos. The stained glass windows, depicting scenes of biblical serenity, were mostly shattered, replaced with rough wooden planks that did little to keep out the cold. The air was thick with a scent of antiseptic, blood, and unwashed bodies. Cots lined the nave, each one occupied by a soldier in some stage of pain or recovery. The constant murmur of prayers mingled with the groans of the injured and the hushed conversations of the medical staff. Isabel worked tirelessly, her hands moving swiftly and surely, cleaning wounds, administering morphine, offering words of comfort. She had learned to detach herself emotionally, to focus on the immediate needs of her patients. But tonight, the detachment was harder to maintain. The image of Samuel's name, scrawled in the mud, kept flashing before her eyes, stirring up a maelstrom of emotions she had long suppressed. As the evening wore on, the flow of wounded began to slow. The sounds of battle, though still present, had diminished to a distant rumble. Isabel found herself with a few moments to spare. She sank onto a wooden crate near the entrance of the church, her body aching with exhaustion. She pulled a small, worn photograph from the pocket of her apron. It was a picture of her and Samuel, taken years ago, before the war, before everything had changed. They were standing in a field of wildflowers, bathed in the golden light of a summer afternoon. Samuel was tall and handsome, with a mischievous glint in his eyes and a smile that could melt the coldest heart. Isabel, younger and more carefree, was leaning against him, her head resting on his shoulder, her expression radiating happiness. It was a relic of a different life, a life that seemed impossibly distant now. A life filled with laughter, hope, and the promise of a future together. A future that had been brutally snatched away by the war. She traced the outline of Samuel's face in the photograph, her fingers lingering on his smile. He had been a medical student when the war broke out, full of idealism and a burning desire to help others. He had talked of joining the Royal Army Medical Corps, of using his skills to save lives. But then, he had simply vanished. No letters, no explanations, just silence. Isabel had spent months searching for him, writing letters to every military authority she could think of, clinging to the hope that he was still alive, that he would somehow return to her. But as the war dragged on, and the casualty lists grew longer, her hope had dwindled, replaced by a gnawing sense of loss and betrayal. She had eventually forced herself to accept the reality that Samuel was gone, that he was just another victim of this senseless war. She had buried her grief, throwing herself into her work, dedicating her life to caring for the wounded. But the whisper, the name in the mud, it had reopened old wounds, stirred up feelings she thought she had buried forever. A sudden commotion near the altar drew her attention. A group of stretcher-bearers were carrying in a new patient, a soldier who had been severely wounded in a recent skirmish. Isabel quickly rose to her feet, her instincts kicking in. She pushed aside her personal turmoil and focused on the task at hand. The soldier was unconscious, his face pale and covered in blood. His uniform was torn and shredded, revealing a gaping wound in his chest. Isabel immediately began assessing his injuries, her hands moving swiftly and efficiently. She could hear the ragged sound of his breathing, the faint flutter of his pulse. "He's losing a lot of blood," she said to the orderly assisting her. "We need to stop the bleeding and get him stabilized." They worked quickly and efficiently, cleaning the wound, applying pressure, and administering fluids. The soldier's condition was critical, and Isabel knew that his chances of survival were slim. But she refused to give up. She had seen too much death, too much suffering. She would fight for this man's life with every ounce of her strength and skill. As she worked, she noticed a small, leather-bound book tucked inside the soldier's tunic. It had been partially soaked with blood, but the cover was still intact. She carefully removed it, thinking it might contain some identification or information about the soldier. She opened the book, her fingers trembling slightly. It was a diary, filled with handwritten entries in a neat, precise script. The first few pages contained mundane details of military life, descriptions of the trenches, the food, the camaraderie. But as she turned the pages, she noticed a change in tone. The entries became more personal, more introspective. And then she saw it. A name, written repeatedly throughout the later entries. A name that made her heart stop. Samuel Hayes. The diary belonged to the wounded soldier. And, according to the entries, he knew Samuel. He had served with him. He had been with him when Isabel's hands began to shake uncontrollably. She couldn't breathe. The room seemed to spin around her. She felt a wave of nausea rising in her throat. The orderly looked at her with concern. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She couldn't answer. She could only stare at the diary, at the name that had haunted her for years. Samuel. He was alive. He had been here in France, fighting in this brutal war. And this soldier, this dying man, might hold the key to finding him, or the key to the truth about why he had disappeared. The soldier on the cot moaned, drawing Isabel's attention, and her hand, almost of its own volition, reached out to take his, to somehow connect to him, to Samuel. Chapter 3. The Letter from Nowhere. Isabel's grip tightened on the soldier's hand, a desperate attempt to anchor herself to reality. The diary lay open on her lap, the name Samuel Hayes a stark accusation in the flickering candlelight. The orderly, a young man named Thomas, a cruel twist of fate. That name was watching her with growing concern. "Ma'am," he repeated, his voice laced with urgency, "you're pale as a ghost. Are you ill?" Isabel forced herself to take a deep breath, to regain some semblance of composure. She couldn't afford to fall apart now. This soldier's life was hanging in the balance, and he might be her only link to Samuel. I'm fine, Thomas," she managed, her voice trembling slightly. "Just a bit overwhelmed." She gestured towards the diary. This man. He knew someone I used to know." Thomas nodded, his expression understanding. "It's the war, ma'am. It brings up all sorts of things." He didn't press her further, for which she was grateful. They continued to work on the soldier, struggling to stem the bleeding and stabilize his condition. But despite their best efforts, his pulse grew weaker, his breathing more shallow. Isabel knew, with a sinking heart, that he was slipping away. As the last vestiges of life faded from the soldier's eyes, Isabel felt a profound sense of loss, not just for this man, but for the hope he represented. The hope of finding Samuel, of finally understanding his disappearance. She gently closed the soldier's eyes, murmuring a silent prayer. Then, she carefully removed the diary from his tunic, clutching it to her chest like a precious relic. "We did all we could," Thomas said softly, his voice filled with a weariness that mirrored her own. Isabel nodded, unable to speak. She felt numb, drained of all emotion. She had witnessed death countless times, but this felt different. This was personal. This was connected to her past, to the life she had lost. She left the field hospital, the diary tucked safely inside her apron pocket. The night air was cold and crisp, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the church. The sounds of battle had faded to a distant murmur, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the nearby trees. She walked aimlessly, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She needed to be alone, to process what she had just learned. She needed to read the diary, to uncover the truth about Samuel. She found a secluded spot beneath a large oak tree, its branches silhouetted against the moonlit sky. She sat down, leaning against the trunk, and pulled out the diary. Her hands were trembling as she opened it, her heart pounding in her chest. She began to read, slowly and carefully, deciphering the soldier's neat handwriting. The early entries were, as she had suspected, filled with mundane details of military life. But as she progressed, the tone shifted. The soldier, whose name was Lieutenant Edward Miller, began to write about his friendship with Samuel Hayes. He described Samuel as a brilliant and compassionate doctor, a man who was deeply affected by the suffering he witnessed. He wrote about Samuel's courage, his dedication to his patients, his unwavering commitment to saving lives. He also wrote about Samuel's sadness, his sense of isolation, his longing for something he couldn't quite articulate. Isabel read with growing fascination, her heart aching with a mixture of joy and sorrow. It was as if she was getting to know Samuel all over again, seeing him through the eyes of another man. She learned things about him she had never known, things that made her love him even more. But there was also a sense of unease, a nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. Edward's entries hinted at a secret, a burden that Samuel was carrying. He wrote about Samuel's frequent disappearances, his secretive meetings, his reluctance to talk about his past. And then she found it, the entry that explained everything. October 27th, 1917. Samuel is gone. He left this morning, without a word to anyone. He just vanished.
I don't know where he went or why.
He left this letter for me, but he made me swear not to open it unless something happened to him.
I'm worried sick.
I have a bad feeling about this. I fear he's involved in something dangerous, something beyond the scope of his medical duties. I pray he's all right. Isabel's breath caught in her throat. A letter. Samuel had left a letter. And Edward, the soldier she had just tried to save, had been the one entrusted with it. She frantically searched through the diary, hoping to find more information about the letter. But there was nothing. The remaining entries were brief and sporadic, filled with the soldier's own struggles and anxieties. She closed the diary, her mind reeling. The letter. It was the key to everything. The key to Samuel's disappearance, to his secret, to his fate. But where was it? Had Edward kept it with him? Had it been lost or destroyed? She rose to her feet, her legs shaky. She had to find that letter. She had to know the truth. She returned to the field hospital, her heart pounding with a renewed sense of urgency. She searched through Edward's belongings, hoping to find some clue, some indication of where the letter might be. But there was nothing. His pockets were empty, his uniform devoid of any personal items. She questioned Thomas, the orderly, but he couldn't recall seeing any letter. He had helped to prepare Edward's body for burial, and he was certain that there had been nothing of significance on his person. Isabel felt a wave of despair wash over her. The letter was gone. Her last hope of finding Samuel, of understanding his past, had vanished. She stepped outside, leaning her back on the cold stone of the church's exterior. Then, her fingers brushed something in her apron pocket. Beneath the diary, a folded piece of paper. A letter, sealed, with her name on it, in Samuel's handwriting. Chapter 4. Scars of the Psalm. Isabel's fingers trembled as she held the sealed letter, the paper brittle and yellowed with age. Her name, Isabel Hartley, was written in Samuel's familiar script, a ghost from the past reaching out to touch her across the chasm of war and time. The sight of it sent a shiver of both anticipation and dread through her. This was it, the answer to the questions that had haunted her for years, the key to unlocking the mystery of Samuel's disappearance. She found a quiet corner within the ravaged church, the only illumination coming from a single flickering candle on a makeshift altar. The air was still thick with the scent of disinfectant and suffering, but for the moment, Isabel was oblivious to her surroundings. Her entire world had narrowed down to this single piece of paper, this fragile link to the man she had loved and lost. With a deep, unsteady breath, she broke the seal and carefully unfolded the letter. The paper crackled softly, the sound echoing in the vast emptiness of the church. The ink had faded slightly, but Samuel's handwriting was still clear and legible, each stroke a testament to the man she remembered. My dearest Isabel, if you are reading this, it means I am either dead or have been forced to disappear in a way that will make it impossible for us to be together, at least for a time. I know this will cause you pain, and for that, I am truly sorry. I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I hope that one day you will understand why I had to do this. Isabel's heart ached as she read those words. The pain of his absence, the years of uncertainty, the unanswered questions, it all came flooding back, intensified by the knowledge that he had anticipated her suffering. There are things I cannot tell you, secrets that I must keep, even from you. My work has taken me down a path that is fraught with danger, a path that requires absolute secrecy. I am involved in something far greater than myself, something that could impact the outcome of this war. I cannot say more, for your own safety and for the success of my mission. A sense of unease crept into Isabel's heart. What kind of work could be so dangerous, so secretive? What could possibly justify his abandoning her without a word? I know this is not enough, that it will not ease your pain. But please, believe me when I say that I have never stopped loving you. You are the light that guides me through the darkness, the hope that sustains me in this hellish world. Every decision I have made, every risk I have taken, has been with the thought of you, of a future where we can finally be together, free from the shadows of war. Tears streamed down Isabel's face as she read those words. His love, his enduring love, shone through every line, a beacon of hope in the midst of despair. But it was a bittersweet love, tinged with the knowledge of his absence, of the secrets he kept. If I am alive, and if it is ever safe to do so, I will find you. I will explain everything. Until then, please try to live your life. Find happiness. Forget me if you must. But know that I will always carry you in my heart. With all my love, Samuel. Isabel folded the letter carefully, her hands trembling. The letter was both a revelation and a further enigma. It confirmed his love, his enduring devotion, but it also deepened the mystery surrounding his disappearance. He was involved in something dangerous, something secret, something related to the war effort. But what? She reread the letter several times, searching for clues, for any hint of his true purpose. The phrase "something that could impact the outcome of this war" stood out to her. It suggested that he was involved in something more than just medical work. Espionage? Intelligence gathering? Sabotage? The possibilities were endless, and each one was more terrifying than the last. She imagined Samuel, her gentle, compassionate Samuel, navigating the treacherous world of spies and counter-spies, risking his life for a cause he couldn't even share with her. A sudden sound startled her, the the creak of a floorboard behind her. She quickly turned, her heart pounding. It was Thomas, the orderly, his face etched with concern. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I saw the light. Are you all right?" Isabel quickly wiped away her tears, trying to compose herself. She couldn't let him see how distraught she was. I'm fine, Thomas," she said, her voice still shaky. "Just reading a letter." Thomas nodded, his gaze lingering on the letter in her hand. He seemed to hesitate, as if he wanted to say something more. Did you find anything else among Lieutenant Miller's belongings?" Isabel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas shook his head. "Nothing, ma'am. I'm sorry." Isabel sighed, her shoulders slumping with disappointment. The letter was her only clue, her only link to Samuel. He spoke of Samuel often, Thomas continued, in his delirium. He said Samuel saved his life, back on the Somme. Isabel looked up, startled. "The Somme?" Thomas nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Said it was a miracle they both made it out alive. Said Samuel carried him for miles, under heavy fire.
Said he owed him his life."
The Somme. The name sent a chill down Isabel's spine. It was the site of one of the bloodiest battles of the war, a place of unimaginable horror and carnage. The thought of Samuel being there, risking his life to save another man, filled her with a mixture of pride and terror. The scars of the Somme, both literal and figurative. That's what Edward had, and what Samuel must have, too, wherever he was. She folded the letter and placed it beside the diary, against her heart. Chapter 5. The Orderly's Secret. The weight of Samuel's letter pressed against Isabel's heart, a tangible reminder of the secrets and dangers that separated them. Thomas's words about the Somme echoed in her mind, painting a vivid picture of the horrors Samuel must have endured. She felt a renewed determination to uncover the truth, to find him, no matter the cost. The following days passed in a blur of activity. The field hospital was once again overwhelmed with wounded soldiers, the casualties from a renewed offensive. Isabel worked tirelessly, her hands moving with a practiced efficiency that belied the turmoil within her. She pushed aside her personal anxieties, focusing on the immediate needs of her patients. But beneath the surface, the search for Samuel consumed her thoughts. She reread Samuel's letter and Edward's diary countless times, searching for clues, for any hint of his whereabouts or his secret mission. She questioned the other medical staff, subtly probing for any information about Samuel Hayes. But no one seemed to know anything about him, or if they did, they weren't willing to talk. She began to feel a growing sense of frustration and despair. It was as if Samuel had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace behind. She started to doubt herself, to wonder if she was chasing a ghost, a figment of her imagination. But then one evening, as she was preparing to leave the hospital, Thomas approached her, his expression hesitant and guarded. "Ma'am," he said softly, "can I have a word with you? In private?" Isabel's heart skipped a beat. She had sensed that Thomas knew more than he was letting on. His eyes held a mixture of sympathy and apprehension, as if he was struggling with a secret he was reluctant to share. She nodded, leading him to a small, deserted storage room at the back of the hospital. The room was dimly lit, filled with crates of medical supplies and the musty scent of old canvas. "What is it, Thomas?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the floor. "It's about Lieutenant Miller and Dr. Hayes." Isabel's pulse quickened. "What about them?" Thomas hesitated, his hands clenching and unclenching. "I may have misled you, ma'am. About Lieutenant Miller's belongings." Isabel stared at him, her mind racing. "What do you mean?" "There was something else," Thomas said, his voice barely audible. "Something I didn't tell you about. Something I found among his things." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. It was intricately engraved with a delicate floral pattern. Isabel's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the locket. It was identical to one she had given Samuel, years ago, as a token of her love. Where did you get this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "It was in Lieutenant Miller's pocket," Thomas said. I didn't know what to do with it. I knew it must be important, but I was afraid to tell anyone. Isabel took the locket, her fingers tracing the intricate design. She opened it carefully, revealing 2 miniature portraits. One was of Samuel, his youthful face smiling back at her, a stark contrast to the haunted man she imagined him to be now. The other was of a young woman, a stranger, with dark hair and piercing eyes. Isabel felt a pang of jealousy, a sharp stab of pain in her heart. Who was this woman? And why was her picture in Samuel's locket? Do you know who she is? Isabel asked, her voice tight with emotion. Thomas shook his head.
No, ma'am.
But there was something else. A note, tucked inside the locket. He handed her a small, folded piece of paper, its edges frayed and torn. Isabel unfolded it carefully, her heart pounding in her chest. The note was written in a hurried, almost illegible script. It was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakably Samuel's. Meet me at the rendezvous point. Midnight. It's urgent. Bring the documents. Isabel's mind raced. The rendezvous point? Documents? What documents? And who was this woman in the locket? Was she involved in Samuel's secret mission? Thomas, she said, her voice urgent. Why didn't you tell me about this before? Thomas looked down, his face flushed with shame. I was scared, ma'am.
I didn't know who to trust.
I knew Lieutenant Miller and Dr. Hayes were involved in something dangerous.
I didn't want to get involved.
But you are involved, Thomas, Isabel said softly. You're the only one who can help me find him. She looked at him, her eyes pleading. The rendezvous point. Do you know where it is? Thomas hesitated, his gaze shifting nervously. I might. Lieutenant Miller used to talk about a place, an abandoned abbey near Reims. He said it was a safe place, a place where they could meet in secret. Reims. The name sent a shiver down Isabel's spine. It was a city on the front lines, a place of constant danger and uncertainty. But it was also a place where she might find Samuel. Thomas, she said, her voice firm, I need you to take me there. To the abbey. Thomas looked at her, his eyes wide with fear. Ma'am, it's too dangerous. We could be killed. I have to go, Thomas, Isabel said, her voice unwavering. I have to find him. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of desperation and determination. Please, Thomas.
Help me.
He looked at her, torn by conflicting emotions. Finally, with another deep breath, and with a look of dread creeping over his face, he nodded. Chapter 6. Rendezvous at Reims. The journey to Reims was a perilous undertaking. Isabel and Thomas, disguised as a relief worker and her driver, navigated treacherous roads, dodging military checkpoints and the ever-present threat of shelling. The landscape was a desolate panorama of shattered buildings, cratered fields, and the skeletal remains of trees, a stark testament to the brutal reality of war. Isabel clutched the locket and the note, her only tangible links to Samuel. The image of the unknown woman in the locket haunted her, fueling a mixture of jealousy and apprehension. Who was she, and what was her connection to Samuel? Was she a lover, a colleague, or something else entirely? Thomas, despite his initial reluctance, proved to be a resourceful and courageous companion. He navigated the back roads with a practiced ease, his knowledge of the local terrain proving invaluable. He spoke little, but his quiet determination gave Isabel a sense of reassurance. As they approached Reims, the sounds of battle grew louder, the distant rumble of artillery a constant reminder of the dangers that lay ahead. The city itself was a shadow of its former glory, its once grand buildings reduced to rubble, its streets deserted and eerily silent. The abandoned abbey, Thomas explained, was located on the outskirts of the city, hidden amidst a cluster of overgrown trees. It had been partially destroyed by shelling, but its secluded location made it an ideal meeting place for clandestine activities. They arrived at the abbey under the cover of darkness. The moon, a sliver of silver in the inky sky, cast long, eerie shadows across the ruined structure. The air was cold and damp, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant sounds of warfare. Isabel felt a shiver of apprehension as she stepped out of the vehicle. The abbey was a ghostly silhouette against the night sky, its crumbling walls and shattered windows a testament to the destructive power of war. It felt like a place of secrets, a place where anything could happen. "Are you sure this is the right place?" she whispered to Thomas, her voice trembling slightly. Thomas nodded, his eyes scanning the surroundings nervously.
"This is it, ma'am."
Lieutenant Miller described it perfectly. They made their way cautiously towards the abbey, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. The entrance was a gaping hole in the wall, the remnants of a once grand archway. They stepped inside, their eyes slowly adjusting to the darkness. The interior of the abbey was a scene of utter devastation. The roof had collapsed in several places, leaving gaping holes that exposed the night sky. The floor was covered in rubble, broken furniture, and shattered glass. The air was thick with the musty scent of decay and damp earth. "Stay close," Thomas whispered, his hand resting on the pistol he carried beneath his coat. They moved slowly through the ruins, their senses on high alert. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional creak of a loose board or the rustling of unseen creatures. They reached the main hall of the abbey, a vast, cavernous space that had once been a place of worship. The remnants of stained glass windows, depicting scenes of religious significance, lay shattered on the floor. A large stone altar, partially destroyed, stood at the far end of the hall. "Where do we go now?" Isabel whispered, her voice echoing in the vast emptiness. Thomas pointed towards a narrow doorway on the far side of the hall. "There's a crypt beneath the abbey." Lieutenant Miller said it was the safest place to meet. They made their way cautiously towards the doorway, their hearts pounding in their chests. The crypt, Thomas explained, was a series of underground chambers that had once been used to bury the abbey's monks. They descended a narrow, winding staircase, the darkness growing thicker with each step. The air was cold and damp, the silence even more oppressive than above. They reached the bottom of the stairs and entered a long, narrow corridor. The walls were lined with stone tombs, their inscriptions barely visible in the dim light. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and decay. "This way," Thomas whispered, leading them down the corridor. They reached a large, central chamber, its ceiling supported by thick stone pillars. The chamber was empty, except for a few scattered remnants of furniture and a large, stone sarcophagus in the center. "This is it," Thomas said, his voice barely audible. "This is where they used to meet." Isabel looked around, her heart sinking. The chamber was deserted. There was no sign of Samuel, no sign of anyone. "He's not here," she whispered, her voice filled with disappointment. Thomas shook his head. "We're early."
"The note said midnight."
"We have to wait." They waited in silence, the tension growing with each passing moment. The minutes stretched into an eternity, the silence broken only by the occasional drip of water and the distant rumble of artillery. Isabel clutched the locket, her fingers tracing the image of Samuel's face. She closed her eyes, trying to imagine him here, in this dark, desolate place. She tried to conjure up his voice, his smile, his touch. Suddenly, they heard a noise. A faint scraping sound, coming from the corridor behind them. Thomas quickly drew his pistol, his eyes wide with alarm. "Someone's coming," he whispered. Isabel's heart pounded in her chest. Was it Samuel? Or someone else? The scraping sound was closing in. Someone or something was coming, and they could do nothing but wait. Chapter 7. Between the lines of fire. The scraping sound grew closer, the tension in the crypt thick enough to choke on. Thomas stood poised, his pistol aimed at the entrance of the corridor, his body a tense silhouette in the dim light. Isabel held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. Was it Samuel? Or an enemy? Or worse, someone who knew Samuel, someone connected to his secret life? A figure emerged from the darkness, slowly, hesitantly. It was a woman, tall and slender, her face obscured by the shadows, her clothing dark and nondescript. She paused at the entrance to the chamber, her eyes scanning the surroundings, taking in the scene before her. Isabel felt a jolt of recognition, a sharp pang of both relief and apprehension. It was the woman from the locket. The woman whose picture Samuel had carried with him. The woman whose identity had haunted Isabel for days. The woman stepped further into the chamber, her gaze settling on Isabel. Her eyes, dark and piercing, held a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She was beautiful, Isabel realized, with a striking, almost ethereal quality. Her features were delicate, her expression composed, but there was a hardness in her eyes, a hint of steel beneath the surface.
Who are you?
The woman asked, her voice low and controlled, with a slight French accent that sent a shiver down Isabel's spine. And what are you doing here? Isabel hesitated, unsure of how to answer. She couldn't reveal her true identity, not yet. She didn't know who this woman was, or what her connection to Samuel was. We were told to wait here, Isabel said, her voice trembling slightly. For someone. The woman's eyes narrowed.
Who told you?
A friend, Isabel said, choosing her words carefully. He said this was a safe place to meet. The woman studied her intently, her gaze piercing. You're English, she said, her voice laced with suspicion. What are you doing in Reims? I'm a nurse, Isabel said, hoping her profession would lend her some credibility. I'm here to help the wounded. The woman didn't seem convinced. And your companion? She asked, her gaze shifting to Thomas, who still stood poised with his pistol. He's my driver, Isabel said. He helps me get around. The woman raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical. A nurse with a driver who carries a pistol? That's unusual, wouldn't you say? Isabel felt a surge of fear. This woman was sharp, perceptive. She wouldn't be easily fooled. These are dangerous times, Isabel said, trying to maintain a calm facade. We have to be careful. The woman took a step closer, her eyes fixed on Isabel. You haven't told me your name, she said. Isabel hesitated. She couldn't use her real name, not yet. She needed to know more about this woman, about her connection to Samuel. My name is Eleanor, Isabel said, choosing a name at random. Eleanor Smith. The woman's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Eleanor, she repeated, her voice soft, almost mocking. And you're waiting for someone. Someone who told you to meet here, at this abandoned abbey. Someone who is involved in sensitive matters. Isabel's heart skipped a beat. This woman knew about Samuel's secret mission. She was part of it. Yes, Isabel said, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman took another step closer, her eyes locking with Isabel's. And what makes you think you can trust me, Eleanor? She asked, her voice a silken whisper. Isabel met her gaze, her heart pounding. She had to take a chance. She had to trust her instincts. Because you're the woman in the locket, Isabel said, her voice trembling slightly. The woman Samuel carries with him. The woman's expression changed, a flicker of surprise crossing her features. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a locket, identical to the one Isabel held. She opened it, revealing the two miniature portraits, Samuel and herself. His name is Samuel Hayes, the woman said, and he's the best double agent we ever had. A sudden explosion rocked the abbey, shaking the ground and sending dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. The sound of gunfire erupted outside, close by, shattering the silence. We have to go, the woman said, her voice urgent. They've found us. She grabbed Isabel's arm, pulling her towards the corridor.
Come on.
We have to get out of here. Thomas, his pistol still drawn, followed close behind. They ran through the dark, winding corridors of the crypt, the sounds of battle growing louder with each step. They were caught between the lines of fire, trapped in a deadly game of cat and mouse. Isabel's mind struggled to comprehend. Double agent?
Samuel?
Chapter 8. A stolen moment in Peron. The flight from the abbey was a chaotic blur of darkness, gunfire, and the constant, heart-stopping fear of discovery. The woman, who Isabel now knew was a key player in Samuel's clandestine world, moved with a swift, sure-footed grace, guiding them through the labyrinthine corridors and out into the shattered streets of Reims. Thomas, his pistol at the ready, covered their retreat, his face grim and determined. Isabel struggled to keep up, her lungs burning, her legs aching. The reality of Samuel's double life was still sinking in, a shocking revelation that had turned her world upside down. He wasn't just a doctor, a healer, he was a spy, a deceiver, living a life of constant danger and deception. They navigated the war-torn streets, dodging behind crumbling walls and shattered vehicles, the sounds of battle echoing all around them. The woman, whose name Isabel still didn't know, led them with a confident authority, her knowledge of the city proving invaluable. They finally reached a small, unassuming house on the outskirts of Reims, its windows dark and shuttered. The woman produced a key and quickly unlocked the door, ushering them inside. The interior of the house was sparsely furnished, but clean and surprisingly intact. It seemed to be a safe house, a temporary refuge from the chaos outside. The woman lit a single oil lamp, casting a flickering glow across the room. "We're safe here for now," she said, her voice low and controlled. She turned to Isabel, her eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "You still haven't told me your real name," she said. "Or how you knew about Samuel." Isabel hesitated, her mind racing. She still didn't fully trust this woman, but she knew she needed her help. She decided to reveal the truth, or at least part of it. "My name is Isabel Hartley," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Samuel and we were engaged. Before the war." The woman's expression softened slightly, a flicker of understanding crossing her features. "I see," she said softly. "So, you're the one she trailed off," her voice tinged with a hint of sadness. "He disappeared," Isabel continued, her voice filled with emotion. "Just before the war. I didn't know what had happened to him. Until I found his name, written in the mud, near a trench. And then a soldier's diary.
And a letter."
She pulled out Samuel's letter and the locket, showing them to the woman. The woman examined them carefully, her eyes lingering on Samuel's handwriting. "He told me he was involved in something dangerous," Isabel said, her voice breaking. "Something that could impact the outcome of the war. But he wouldn't tell me what it was." The woman nodded, her expression grim. "He couldn't. It was too risky. He was working undercover, infiltrating German intelligence. He was gathering information, feeding them false leads, sabotaging their operations." Isabel's mind reeled. Samuel, her gentle, compassionate Samuel, was living a double life, walking a tightrope between two warring factions, risking his life every single day. "His code name is Nightingale," the woman continued. "He's one of our most valuable assets. He's saved countless lives, provided us with crucial intelligence. But he's also in constant danger. The Germans are suspicious. They're looking for him."
"And you?"
Isabel asked, her voice filled with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "What's your role in all of this?" The woman smiled faintly. "My name is Claire Dubois," she said. "I'm his handler. I'm the one who gives him his orders, provides him with support, helps him stay alive."
"Claire."
The name echoed in Isabel's mind. The woman in the locket. Samuel's colleague, his confidant, perhaps even his lover. "We've been working together for over 2 years," Claire continued. "We've been through a lot together. We've learned to trust each other, to rely on each other." Isabel felt a pang of jealousy, a sharp stab of pain in her heart. She couldn't help but wonder about the nature of their relationship. Had their shared danger, their shared secrets, forged a bond that went beyond professional camaraderie? "He talks about you often," Claire said, her voice softening. "He says you're the reason he keeps fighting, the hope that sustains him." Isabel's heart ached. Samuel's love, his enduring love, was still there, but it was now intertwined with a complex web of secrets, lies, and danger. "I need to see him," Isabel said, her voice filled with desperation. "I need to know he's all right." Claire hesitated, her eyes filled with concern.
"It's too risky," she said.
"He's deep undercover. Any contact with you could compromise his mission, put his life in danger." "But I have to see him," Isabel insisted, her voice pleading. "I have to know the truth." Claire studied her intently, her gaze piercing. She seemed to be weighing the risks, calculating the odds. "There might be a way," she said finally, her voice low and hesitant. "He's scheduled to be in Paran next week. A brief meeting to exchange information. It's a long shot, but I might be able to arrange a brief encounter. A few minutes, no more. It would be incredibly dangerous for both of you."
Paran.
Another city on the front lines, another place of constant danger. But it was a slim chance to see Samuel, to hold him, to know he was alive. "I'll do it," Isabel said, her voice firm. "I'll take the risk." Claire gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. She would help. And maybe, Isabel thought, she'd come to understand the woman in the locket was more ally than rival. They both loved the same man, a man living a dangerous and secret existence. A small private room. A few stolen moments in a city under siege. A single touch. This might be all she would ever have. Chapter 9. The Cost of Silence. The week leading up to the potential meeting in Paran was an agonizing stretch of waiting and uncertainty. Isabel continued her work at the field hospital, tending to the endless stream of wounded soldiers, but her mind was elsewhere, consumed by thoughts of Samuel and the risks he faced. She and Claire met secretly several times, carefully planning the logistics of the brief encounter, weighing the dangers against the desperate need for Isabel to see him. Claire was a complex and enigmatic figure, a woman hardened by war and shrouded in secrecy. She was fiercely protective of Samuel, her loyalty to him unwavering, but she also seemed to carry a deep sadness, a sense of weariness that hinted at the toll her work had taken. Isabel found herself both drawn to and intimidated by her, recognizing in her a kindred spirit, a woman who understood the sacrifices and the heartaches of loving a man living on the edge. The plan was fraught with peril. Paran was a strategic location, heavily contested by both sides. The meeting would have to be brief, clandestine, and meticulously timed. Any misstep, any hint of suspicion, could lead to disaster, not only for Isabel and Samuel, but for Claire and the entire intelligence network she operated. Isabel confided in Thomas, sharing the bare minimum of details, enough to secure his continued assistance. He was understandably apprehensive, but his loyalty to Isabel and his growing respect for Samuel's bravery compelled him to help. As the day of the planned meeting approached, the tension mounted. Isabel found it increasingly difficult to focus on her work, her hands trembling as she bandaged wounds and administered medications. She was haunted by nightmares, visions of Samuel captured, tortured, or killed. The night before the journey to Paran, Claire came to Isabel's quarters, her face etched with concern. "I've received word," she said, her voice low and grave. "The Germans are increasing their patrols in Paran. They're suspicious. They know something is happening." Isabel's heart sank. "What does that mean?" "It means the risk is even greater," Claire said. "We have to be even more careful." "Should we call it off?" Isabel asked, her voice trembling. Claire hesitated. "That's your decision," she said. "But if we do, I don't know when or if another opportunity will arise." Isabel's mind raced. She had come this far, endured so much, all for the chance to see Samuel. But she couldn't bear the thought of putting his life in even greater danger. "What does Samuel say?" Isabel asked. Claire's expression softened slightly.
"He doesn't know about this," she said.
"I haven't told him you're here. I didn't want to distract him, to compromise his focus." Isabel understood. Samuel's work demanded absolute concentration, unwavering dedication. Any distraction, any emotional turmoil, could be fatal. "But if I were to let him know," Claire continued, with the briefest flicker of a smile, "he would move heaven and earth to be there. You matter that much." "I'll go," Isabel said, her voice firm, despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. "I have to see him." Claire nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of respect and apprehension. "Then we leave at dawn," she said. "And we pray for the best." The journey to Paran was even more harrowing than the previous one. They traveled in a battered ambulance, disguised as medical personnel, navigating treacherous roads and dodging military convoys. The sounds of battle were closer, more intense, the air thick with the smell of smoke and cordite. As they approached Peron, they could see the city burning in the distance, plumes of black smoke rising into the sky. The streets were deserted, except for the occasional patrol of German soldiers. Claire led them to a small, abandoned cafe on the outskirts of the city, its windows shattered, its interior filled with rubble. This was the designated meeting place, a seemingly innocuous location that offered a degree of cover. "He should be here soon," Claire said, her voice tense. "We have to be quick. 5 minutes, no more." They waited in silence, the tension almost unbearable. Isabel's heart pounded in her chest, her senses on high alert. Every sound, every movement, sent a jolt of fear through her. Suddenly, they heard a faint noise, a soft tapping on the back door of the cafe. Claire exchanged a look with Isabel, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She moved cautiously towards the door, her hand resting on the pistol she carried beneath her coat. She opened the door a crack, peering outside. Then, she stepped back, her face breaking into a relieved smile. "It's him," she whispered. Isabel's heart leaped with joy. Samuel. He was here. He was alive. She rushed to the door, her eyes eagerly searching the darkness. And then she saw him. He stood, silhouetted against the pre-dawn light, and time seemed to still, to hold its breath, just as she was doing. Chapter 10. Echoes in the Abbey. Samuel. Even in the dim light, obscured by the shadows and the ravages of war, he was unmistakable. Taller and leaner than she remembered, his face etched with lines of hardship and weariness, his eyes holding a depth of experience that both intrigued and saddened her. But it was him. The man she had loved, the man she had mourned, the man who had haunted her dreams for years. He stepped inside the cafe, his gaze immediately locking with Isabel's. His eyes widened in disbelief, a flicker of shock, and then an overwhelming surge of emotion crossing his features. "Isabel?" he whispered, his voice hoarse, barely audible. "Is it really you?" Isabel couldn't speak. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision. She could only nod, her heart overflowing with a mixture of joy, relief, and a profound sense of disbelief. He rushed towards her, his arms outstretched, and enveloped her in a fierce embrace. The years of separation, the pain, the uncertainty, all melted away in that single moment. She clung to him, her body trembling, her face buried in his shoulder. She inhaled the familiar scent of him, a mixture of soap, sweat, and something indefinably Samuel, a scent that transported her back to a time before the war, before the secrets, before the pain. I thought I'd lost you," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. His grip tightened, as if he feared she might disappear if he let go. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice muffled against his coat. "I'm here." They held each other for what seemed like an eternity, oblivious to the danger that surrounded them, lost in the sheer joy of being reunited. The world outside the shattered cafe, the war, the secrets, all faded into insignificance. There was only this moment, this precious, stolen moment of reconnection. Claire cleared her throat softly, a gentle reminder of the precariousness of their situation. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of urgency and sympathy. Samuel reluctantly released Isabel, his eyes searching her face, taking in every detail. He looked older, more worn, but his eyes still held that familiar spark of intelligence and kindness, the spark that had first captured her heart. How did you find me?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. Isabel briefly explained about the whisper in the mud, the soldier's diary, the letter, and Thomas's help. Samuel listened intently, his expression a mixture of amazement and disbelief. "Edward," he murmured, his voice tinged with sadness. "He was a good man. I owe him my life."
"He spoke of you," Isabel said.
"He said you saved him at the Somme." Samuel nodded, his gaze drifting towards the shattered window, his eyes filled with a distant, haunted look. "The Somme," he repeated softly. "It was hell on earth." He turned back to Isabel, his eyes focusing on hers. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice filled with remorse. For everything. For leaving you, for not telling you the truth. I understand, Isabel said, her voice trembling. Claire told me. About your work. Samuel's expression darkened. It's a dangerous game, Isabel, he said. A game of lies and deception. A game where one wrong move can cost you your life. But you're saving lives, Isabel said, her voice filled with admiration. Claire said you're one of their most valuable assets. Samuel smiled faintly, a flicker of pride crossing his features. It's my duty, he said, to do what I can to end this war. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His touch was warm and familiar, sending a shiver of electricity through her. I've never stopped loving you, Isabel, he said, his voice filled with emotion. You're the reason I keep fighting, the hope that sustains me. Isabel's heart ached with love for him, a love that had endured the years of separation, the pain, the uncertainty. And I love you, Samuel, more than words can say, she replied. They gazed at each other, their eyes locked, lost in a world of shared memories and unspoken promises. The seconds ticked by, precious and fleeting. Claire stepped forward, her expression apologetic. I'm sorry, she said, her voice soft but firm. We have to go.
Now.
Samuel nodded, his eyes filled with regret. He squeezed Isabel's hand, his touch lingering. Will I see you again? Isabel asked, her voice filled with a desperate hope. Samuel hesitated. I don't know, he said. It's too dangerous. But I promise you if there's any way, I'll find you. He leaned down and kissed her, a brief, tender kiss that conveyed all the love, all the longing, all the unspoken words that had been building between them for years. It was a kiss that tasted of hope and despair, of love and loss, of a future that was uncertain but a past which had connected them irrevocably. Then he was gone. He slipped out the back door of the cafe, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as he had appeared. Isabel stood there, her heart aching, her body trembling. The brief encounter, the stolen moment, had been both a blessing and a curse. It had rekindled her love, reaffirmed her hope, but it had also left her with a profound sense of loss, a yearning for a future that might never be. Claire placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. He'll be all right, she said, her voice filled with a quiet confidence. He's strong. He's resourceful. He'll survive. They left, returning to their precarious existence, and all Isabel could do was replay his last words in her mind. Chapter 11. The Unspoken Vow. The return journey from Paran was a silent, somber affair. Isabel sat beside Claire in the ambulance, her mind replaying every moment of the brief encounter with Samuel, clinging to the memory of his touch, his kiss, his words. The joy of seeing him again was tempered by the fear for his safety and the agonizing uncertainty of their future. Claire, sensing Isabel's emotional turmoil, offered what comfort she could, sharing stories of Samuel's bravery and resilience, assuring her that he was doing everything in his power to stay alive. But beneath her confident facade, Isabel could sense Claire's own anxieties, her own fears for the man they both cared for. Back at the field hospital, Isabel threw herself into her work, seeking solace in the familiar routine of caring for the wounded. The endless stream of casualties, the constant demands of her duties, helped to numb the pain, to push aside the overwhelming emotions that threatened to consume her. But in the quiet moments, between patients, or during the long, sleepless nights, the memory of Samuel would return, vivid and poignant, filling her with both longing and dread. She would reread his letter, tracing the lines of his handwriting, searching for some hidden message, some reassurance that he would be all right. She also found herself thinking about Claire, about the complex relationship she shared with Samuel. She realized that Claire was not a rival, but an ally, a woman who understood the sacrifices and the heartaches of loving a man living a double life. She began to appreciate Claire's strength, her courage, her unwavering loyalty to Samuel. Several days after their return from Paran, Thomas approached Isabel, his expression hesitant and guarded. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I have something for you." Something I found in Peron. Isabel's heart skipped a beat. What is it? Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a note, written in Samuel's familiar handwriting. Isabel's hands trembled as she took the note, her heart pounding in her chest. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the words. Isabel, I had to see you, to hold you, even for a moment. It gave me the strength to go on. I don't know when or if I'll see you again, but I want you to know that I'm fighting for a future, for a life where we can be together. I made a vow a long time ago to protect you, to love you, to be with you. That vow still stands. I will return to you. I promise. Samuel, tears welled up in Isabel's eyes as she read those words. His love, his enduring love, shone through every line, a beacon of hope in the midst of darkness. The unspoken vow, the promise of a future together, it was all she had to cling to. Where did you find this? Isabel asked, her voice trembling. Thomas explained that he had found the note tucked inside a crevice in the wall of the abandoned cafe in Peron, near the back door where Samuel had entered. It was clear that Samuel had left it there for Isabel, a secret message, a testament to his love. He must have known you'd find it, Thomas said, his voice filled with admiration. Isabel nodded, her heart overflowing with emotion. Samuel's resourcefulness, his determination, his unwavering love, it gave her strength, it gave her hope. She carefully folded the note, placing it inside the locket with his picture and Claire's, a precious keepsake to be treasured. It was a tangible reminder of his promise, of his unspoken vow. She knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, that the dangers were far from over. But she also knew that she was not alone. She had Samuel's love, Claire's support, and Thomas's loyalty. And she had her own strength, her own determination, her own unwavering commitment to the man she loved. She made a vow of her own, an unspoken vow, to wait for him, to believe in him, to never give up hope. She would continue her work, caring for the wounded, doing her part to end the war. And she would wait, patiently and faithfully, for the day when Samuel would return to her, when they could finally be together, free from the shadows of war and deception. The silence of waiting was the hardest, but she was not idle. She was healing and waiting and hoping. She repeated the vow, silently in the ward, amongst the wounded, with every sunrise. Chapter 12. Betrayal at Dawn. Weeks turned into months, and the war raged on, with no end in sight. Isabel continued her work at the field hospital, the days blurring into a monotonous routine of tending to the wounded, battling exhaustion, and clinging to the hope of Samuel's return. She received no further word from him, no messages, no sign of his presence. The silence was deafening, a constant reminder of the dangers he faced and the uncertainty of their future. Claire, too, was shrouded in silence. She had returned to her clandestine activities, her movements and communications shrouded in secrecy. Isabel understood the need for discretion, but the lack of contact left her feeling increasingly isolated and anxious. One morning, as Isabel was preparing for another long day at the hospital, a commotion erupted outside. She heard shouts, the screech of tires, and the heavy thud of boots on the cobblestones. She rushed to the window, her heart pounding with apprehension. A group of German soldiers, their faces grim and determined, were storming the hospital, their rifles at the ready. They were accompanied by a tall, imposing officer, his uniform immaculate, his expression cold and calculating. Isabel's blood ran cold. The Germans. They had found them. But how? The soldiers burst into the hospital, their shouts echoing through the wards. They began rounding up the medical staff, pushing them against the walls, their weapons trained on them. The patients, many of them still recovering from their injuries, cried out in fear and confusion. Isabel found herself face to face with the German officer. He looked at her with a cold, piercing gaze, his eyes devoid of any compassion. "You are Isabel Hartley?" he asked, his voice harsh and guttural, his accent thick. Isabel hesitated, her mind racing. She knew that denying her identity would be futile. They had found her, and they knew who she was. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling slightly, but holding her head high. The officer smiled, a cruel, chilling smile that sent a shiver down her spine.
"We've been looking for you," he said.
"And for your associate, the Nightingale." Isabel's heart sank. They knew about Samuel. They knew about his code name. They knew about his work as a double agent. "I don't know what you're talking about," Isabel said, trying to maintain a facade of innocence. The officer laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Don't play coy with me, Fräulein," he said. "We know everything. We know about your meetings in Peron. We know about your connection to the British intelligence network." Isabel's mind raced. How could they know so much? Had they been betrayed? Had someone leaked information to the Germans? "We have your friend," the officer continued, his voice dripping with malice. "The one who calls himself Thomas. He was very cooperative. He told us everything." Thomas. Isabel's heart sank. Her loyal, courageous companion. He had been captured, and he had cracked under torture. He had betrayed them. Isabel felt a wave of despair wash over her. Everything was falling apart. Samuel was in danger, she was captured, and their entire network was compromised. "Where is he?" Isabel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where is Samuel?" The officer smiled again, that same cruel, chilling smile. "The Nightingale is singing a different tune now," he said. "He's in our custody, and he's about to face the consequences of his treachery." Isabel felt a surge of anger, a fierce determination to protect Samuel, even if it meant sacrificing her own life. "You won't get away with this," she said, her voice filled with defiance. The officer chuckled. "We already have," he said. "The war is almost over, Fräulein, and you and your precious Nightingale will be on the losing side." He gestured to the soldiers. "Take her away," he ordered. The soldiers grabbed Isabel roughly, their hands bruising her arms. They dragged her out of the hospital, pushing her into the back of a waiting truck. As the truck sped away, Isabel looked back at the hospital, her heart aching. She had failed. She had failed Samuel. She had failed Claire. She had failed herself. The betrayal, the capture, the uncertainty of Samuel's fate, it was all too much to bear. She found herself alone and hurt, but she found something else. Resolve. Samuel wouldn't surrender, and neither would she. As the sun set, as the sky turned colors she couldn't see, she began planning. Chapter 13. The Weight of a Promise. Isabel was taken to a bleak, imposing prison on the outskirts of a small, occupied town. The building was a former military barracks, its stone walls cold and damp, its iron bars a stark reminder of her captivity. She was thrown into a small, sparsely furnished cell, the only light filtering through a narrow, barred window high above. The air was thick with the musty scent of mildew and despair. She spent her first few days in a daze of shock and grief, replaying the events of her capture, agonizing over Thomas's betrayal, and fearing for Samuel's life. The silence of the cell was oppressive, broken only by the occasional footsteps of the guards and the distant sounds of the war. She had no contact with the outside world, no news of Samuel, no idea of what the future held. But as the days passed, Isabel's despair began to give way to a steely resolve. She refused to be broken. She would not surrender to fear or hopelessness. She had made a vow to Samuel, a promise to wait for him, to believe in him, to never give up hope. And she would honor that vow, no matter the cost. She began to use her time to plan, to strategize, to find a way to escape, to find Samuel, to somehow turn the tables on her captors. She knew that the odds were stacked against her, that she was facing a powerful and ruthless enemy. But she also knew that she had nothing to lose. She meticulously examined her cell, searching for any weakness, any flaw in its construction. She tested the bars on the window, the strength of the door, the solidity of the walls. She observed the routines of the guards, their movements, their habits, their weaknesses. She also began to exercise, using the limited space of her cell to keep her body strong and her mind sharp. She did push-ups, sit-ups, and stretches, pushing herself to the limit, channeling her fear and anger into physical exertion. She knew that she needed to be prepared, both physically and mentally, for any opportunity that might arise. She needed to be ready to act quickly, decisively, and without hesitation. One evening, as she was eating the meager rations that were provided, she noticed something unusual. The guard who brought her food, a young man with a weary expression and kind eyes, seemed to hesitate before leaving her cell. He glanced around nervously, as if to make sure they were not being observed, and then slipped a small, folded piece of paper into her hand. Isabel's heart skipped a beat. A message? From whom? She waited until the guard had left, and then quickly unfolded the paper. It was a note, written in a hurried, almost illegible script. Don't lose hope. We're working on a plan. Be ready. The note was unsigned, but Isabel recognized the handwriting. It was Claire's. A surge of hope coursed through Isabel's veins.
Claire was alive.
She was working to free her, to free Samuel. She was not alone. The note gave Isabel renewed strength, renewed determination to survive. She redoubled her efforts, exercising, planning, and observing, preparing herself for the day when she would have a chance to escape. She also began to engage the young guard in conversation, subtly probing for information, trying to gain his trust. She learned that his name was Wilhelm and that he was not a Nazi, but a conscript, forced to serve in the German army against his will. He was disillusioned with the war, disgusted by the brutality of his superiors, and sympathetic to the plight of the prisoners. Isabel sensed an opportunity. She began to cultivate a relationship with Wilhelm, appealing to his sense of decency, his compassion, his desire for peace. She shared stories of her life before the war, of her love for Samuel, of her work as a nurse. Slowly, cautiously, she began to plant the seeds of rebellion in Wilhelm's mind, suggesting that he could help her, that he could make a difference, that he could choose to be on the right side of history. It was a dangerous game, a gamble that could cost her her life. But Isabel was willing to take the risk. She had a promise to keep, a vow to honor, and she would not let anything or anyone stand in her way. The weight of the promise was immense, but it empowered her every single day. She saw it in Wilhelm's eyes, and she knew it was working. She had an ally. One evening, Wilhelm slipped her another note. The plan was ready. Chapter 14. Shattered Reflections. The plan was daring, bordering on suicidal. Claire, with the help of a network of resistance fighters, had orchestrated a complex operation to free Isabel and Samuel, along with several other key prisoners held in the barracks. The success of the mission hinged on precise timing, coordinated action, and a significant element of luck. Wilhelm, now a fully committed, albeit terrified, accomplice, played a crucial role. He provided Isabel with detailed information about the prison layout, the guards' routines, and the location of Samuel's cell. He also agreed to disable the alarm system and create a diversion at the critical moment. The night of the planned escape was cold and moonless, the darkness a welcome cloak for their clandestine activities. Isabel waited in her cell, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. She was dressed in a dark, nondescript uniform that Wilhelm had smuggled to her, a disguise that would hopefully allow her to blend in with the other prisoners. At the designated hour, she heard a faint commotion outside, the sounds of shouting and gunfire. Wilhelm's diversion had begun. Isabel knew that she had only a few precious minutes to act. She quickly retrieved a small, makeshift tool that she had fashioned from a piece of metal she had managed to pry loose from her bed frame. She used the tool to pick the lock on her cell door, her hands trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. The lock clicked open, and Isabel slipped out of her cell, her heart racing. She moved swiftly and silently through the dimly lit corridors, following the instructions that Wilhelm had given her. She encountered several other prisoners, also making their escape, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and terror. She reached Samuel's cell, her heart leaping with anticipation. She quickly picked the lock, her hands moving with practiced ease. The door swung open, and she stepped inside. The cell was dark, the only light filtering through the narrow, barred window. Isabel's eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, and she saw him. Samuel. He was lying on the cot, his body thin and emaciated, his face pale and bruised. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. Isabel rushed to his side, her heart sinking with fear. He was alive, but barely. He had been tortured, she realized, his body bearing the marks of brutal interrogation. Samuel, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She gently shook his shoulder, trying to rouse him. Samuel, wake up. It's me, Isabel. His eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused, his expression filled with confusion. He looked at her, his eyes slowly widening in recognition. Isabel? He whispered, his voice hoarse and weak. Is it really you? Yes, Samuel, it's me, she said, her voice trembling. We're getting out of here. We're escaping. She helped him to sit up, his body stiff and aching. He winced in pain, his hand instinctively reaching for his ribs. They broke my ribs, he whispered, his voice filled with agony. I know, Isabel said softly. But we'll get you to safety. We'll get you help. She helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as he struggled to stand. He was weak and unsteady, but his eyes held a flicker of determination. Claire? He asked, his voice barely audible. Is she? She's safe, Isabel said. She's the one who organized this. She's waiting for us. They made their way slowly and painfully out of the cell, Isabel supporting Samuel's weight, guiding him through the corridors. The sounds of the escape were growing louder, the gunfire more intense. They reached the main gate of the prison, where a chaotic scene was unfolding. Resistance fighters, armed with whatever weapons they could find, were battling the German guards. Explosions rocked the ground, sending plumes of smoke and debris into the air. Claire was there, in the thick of the fighting, her face grim and determined, directing the operation with a cool, confident authority. She saw Isabel and Samuel, and her eyes lit up with relief. This way, she shouted, her voice barely audible above the din of battle. She led them through the gate, into the darkness beyond. They stumbled and ran, the sounds of fighting receding behind. But then came a shout. A German soldier raised his rifle. Isabel saw, and without thinking, she stepped in front of Samuel, shielding him from the shot. The reflection in the puddle on the muddied road was all she saw. The soldier. Samuel. Herself. Then the image shattered as the bullet found its mark. The pain. And Samuel's cry, echoing across the chaos. Chapter 15. The Price of Freedom. The impact of the bullet threw Isabel backward, slamming her against Samuel, the force knocking the wind out of both of them. She felt a searing pain in her shoulder, a burning sensation that spread rapidly through her body. She gasped for breath, her vision blurring, her ears ringing. Samuel cried out, his voice a mixture of anguish and disbelief. Isabel. No. He caught her as she fell, his arms wrapping around her, holding her close. He lowered her gently to the ground, his face etched with terror, his eyes frantically searching her wound. I'm all right, Isabel whispered, her voice weak and strained, though she knew it was a lie. The pain was intense, and she could feel the warm, sticky flow of blood soaking through her uniform. You're not all right, Samuel said, his voice choked with emotion. You're bleeding. Badly. He ripped a strip of cloth from his shirt and pressed it against her wound, trying to stem the flow of blood. His hands were trembling, his face pale and drawn. Claire rushed to their side, her expression grim and determined. We have to get out of here, she said, her voice urgent. Now. She helped Samuel to lift Isabel, supporting her weight as they stumbled away from the prison, towards the cover of the nearby woods. The sounds of battle were fading behind them, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the chirping of crickets. They found a small, secluded clearing, hidden amongst the trees. Samuel gently laid Isabel down on a bed of soft moss, his eyes filled with concern. We need to stop the bleeding, he said, his voice trembling. He examined the wound, his medical training kicking in, his movements swift and efficient despite his own weakened state. The bullet had entered her shoulder, near her collarbone. It had missed any major arteries, but it had caused significant tissue damage. She was losing a lot of blood. Claire produced a small first aid kit from her bag, containing bandages, antiseptic, and a few basic medical supplies. They worked together, cleaning the wound, applying pressure, and bandaging it as best they could. Isabel gritted her teeth, trying to bear the pain. She focused on Samuel's face, on his eyes, on his touch, drawing strength from his presence. "You saved my life," Samuel said, his voice filled with emotion. "You took the bullet for me." Isabel managed a weak smile. "I couldn't let them hurt you," she whispered. "But why, Isabel?" he asked, his voice choked with tears. "Why would you risk your life for me?" "Because I love you, Samuel," she said, her voice barely audible. "I've always loved you, and I always will." Samuel's eyes filled with tears. He leaned down and kissed her, a tender, lingering kiss that conveyed all the love, all the gratitude, all the unspoken words that filled his heart. "We need to get her to a doctor," Claire said, her voice urgent. "She needs proper medical attention." Samuel nodded, his expression grim. "There's a resistance safe house a few miles from here," he said. "We can take her there." They carefully lifted Isabel, supporting her weight as they made their way through the woods. The journey was slow and arduous, Isabel's pain growing with each step. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her body weak and exhausted. They finally reached the safe house, a small, unassuming farmhouse hidden deep in the countryside. The occupants, a family of resistance sympathizers, welcomed them with open arms, providing them with food, shelter, and medical care. A local doctor, a member of the resistance, was summoned to examine Isabel. He cleaned and dressed her wound, administering pain medication and antibiotics. He confirmed that the bullet had missed any vital organs, but he warned that she was still in a critical condition. She had lost a lot of blood, and she was at risk of infection. "She needs rest," the doctor said, "and time to heal." Samuel stayed by Isabel's side day and night, tending to her needs, watching over her, praying for her recovery. He held her hand, stroked her hair, whispered words of love and encouragement. Isabel drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind filled with fragmented memories, dreams, and hallucinations. She saw Samuel's face, heard his voice, felt his touch, clinging to these sensations as anchors to reality. Slowly, gradually, Isabel began to improve. The pain subsided, her fever broke, and her strength returned. She was still weak and exhausted, but she was alive. She had survived. The price of freedom, she realized, was high, but it was a price she was willing to pay. For Samuel, for their future, for the hope of a life together, free from the shadows of war. The whispered vow, the promise in the letter, she held it tightly in her mind. She could feel Samuel's worry, but she knew she had to get better. She had to. Chapter 16. Beyond the Barricades. Isabel's recovery was slow but steady. Samuel's unwavering care, combined with the doctor's skilled attention and the safe house family's kindness, helped her to gradually regain her strength. The bullet wound in her shoulder, though painful, began to heal, and the threat of infection subsided. The days at the safe house were a strange interlude, a pocket of peace and tranquility amidst the raging storm of war. Isabel and Samuel spent hours talking, sharing their stories, their fears, their hopes for the future. They rediscovered the intimacy and connection that had been forged years ago, an intimacy that had been tested by time, distance, and the brutal realities of war, but had ultimately endured. Claire, too, was a frequent visitor, providing updates on the war effort and the ongoing efforts to dismantle the German intelligence network that Samuel had infiltrated. She and Isabel, bound by their shared love for Samuel and their commitment to the cause, developed a deeper understanding and respect for each other. The unspoken rivalry, the lingering jealousy, faded away, replaced by a bond of sisterhood forged in the crucible of shared danger and sacrifice. As Isabel's physical strength returned, so too did her determination to rejoin the fight. She was restless, eager to contribute to the war effort, to help bring an end to the conflict that had shattered so many lives. "I can't just stay here, Samuel," she said one evening as they sat together on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the sunset. "I need to do something. I need to help." Samuel understood her feelings, but he was also concerned for her safety. "You're still recovering, Isabel," he said. "You need more time to heal." "I'm strong enough," she insisted. "And I have skills that are needed. I'm a nurse, Samuel. I can help the wounded, the refugees, the victims of this war." Samuel hesitated, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and admiration. He knew that he couldn't hold her back, that her spirit was too strong, her determination too fierce. "There's a resistance hospital, not far from here," he said finally. "They're desperately short of medical personnel. I could arrange for you to work there." Isabel's face lit up. "Yes," she said. "That would be perfect." And so, Isabel returned to her calling, tending to the wounded and the sick, working alongside other resistance fighters, doctors, and nurses, providing care and comfort in the midst of chaos and destruction. She found a renewed sense of purpose, a sense of fulfillment in using her skills to alleviate suffering and to help those in need. Samuel, meanwhile, continued his clandestine work, gathering intelligence, disrupting German operations, and working to bring an end to the war. He and Isabel met whenever they could, stealing precious moments together, their love a beacon of hope in the darkness. The war was nearing its end. The Allied forces were advancing, pushing back the German army on all fronts. The tide had turned, and victory, though still distant, was within sight. But the final days of the war were also some of the most brutal and dangerous. The fighting intensified, the casualties mounted, and the desperation of the retreating German forces led to acts of unspeakable cruelty. One evening, Samuel came to Isabel at the resistance hospital, his face etched with concern. "I have to go," he said, his voice low and urgent. "There's a mission. A dangerous one. But it could be crucial to ending the war." Isabel's heart sank. She knew that she couldn't stop him, that his duty called him, but the fear for his safety was almost unbearable. "Be careful, Samuel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please be careful." He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His touch was warm and reassuring. "I will," he said. "I promise. And I'll come back to you. I always will." He kissed her, a long, passionate kiss that conveyed all the love, all the longing, all the unspoken words that filled their hearts. Then he was gone. He disappeared into the night, leaving Isabel with a mixture of hope and dread, of love and fear. She stood there, watching the darkness swallow him up, praying for his safe return. She returned to the patients. But her hands, normally so steady, shook. Beyond the barricades, Samuel was fighting. She held on to this fact and worked tirelessly. Chapter 17. A Light in the Darkness. The days that followed Samuel's departure were an agonizing stretch of waiting and uncertainty. Isabel threw herself into her work at the resistance hospital, tending to the endless stream of wounded soldiers and civilians, but her mind was constantly with Samuel, her heart heavy with fear and anxiety. She received no word from him, no messages, no sign of his presence. The silence was deafening, a constant reminder of the dangers he faced. The war, however, was drawing to a close. The Allied forces were making rapid advances, pushing the German army back towards its borders. The news from the front lines was increasingly optimistic, filled with reports of victories and breakthroughs. But the fighting was still fierce, the casualties still mounting, and the outcome, though seemingly inevitable, was not yet certain. Isabel clung to the hope of Samuel's return, replaying his promise in her mind, drawing strength from his love and his unwavering commitment to their future. She found solace in her work, in the camaraderie of her fellow resistance fighters, and in the gratitude of the patients she cared for. One evening, as she was finishing her shift at the hospital, Claire arrived, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "Isabel," she said, her voice trembling, "I have news. About Samuel." Isabel's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and dread.
What is it?
She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Is he all right? Claire hesitated, her gaze shifting away.
He's alive, she said.
But he's been injured. Seriously injured. Isabel's knees buckled, and she had to grip the edge of a nearby table to steady herself. Where is he? She asked, her voice choked with emotion. What happened? Claire explained that Samuel had been involved in a daring raid on a German command post, a mission that had been crucial to disrupting the enemy's defenses and paving the way for the Allied advance. He had succeeded in his objective, but he had been caught in an explosion, sustaining serious injuries. He's been taken to a field hospital near the front lines, Claire said. He's in a critical condition. Isabel's mind raced. She had to get to him. She had to see him, to be with him. I'm going to him, she said, her voice firm, despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. Claire nodded. I'll take you, she said. But it's dangerous, Isabel. The fighting is still intense. I don't care, Isabel said. I have to be with him. They set off immediately, traveling in a battered ambulance, navigating treacherous roads and dodging the remnants of the retreating German army. The sounds of battle were close, the air thick with the smell of smoke and cordite. They finally reached the field hospital, a chaotic scene of tents, stretchers, and wounded soldiers. The air was filled with the cries of the injured, the shouts of the medical staff, and the constant, low thrum of anxiety. Claire led Isabel through the maze of tents, her eyes searching for Samuel. They finally found him, lying on a cot in a small, crowded tent, his body still and pale, his face covered in bandages. Isabel rushed to his side, her heart sinking with fear. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. He looked so frail, so vulnerable, so unlike the strong, confident man she had known. A doctor, his face etched with exhaustion, approached them. He's lost a lot of blood, he said, his voice grim. He has multiple shrapnel wounds and a severe head injury. We've done all we can, but his chances are slim.
Isabel refused to accept that.
She would not let him go. She had come too far, endured too much, to lose him now. She sat beside him, holding his hand, stroking his hair, whispering words of love and encouragement. She spoke to him of their past, of their future, of the life they would have together, once the war was over. She stayed with him through the night, watching over him, praying for a miracle. The hours passed slowly, each one an eternity. The sounds of the hospital, the cries of the wounded, the whispered conversations of the medical staff, all faded into the background. There was only Samuel and her unwavering love for him. As dawn approached, a faint light began to filter through the canvas of the tent. Isabel looked at Samuel, his face still pale and drawn, but his breathing seemed a little stronger, a little more regular. And then, his eyes fluttered open. He looked at her, his gaze weak and unfocused, but filled with recognition. Isabel? He whispered, his voice hoarse and barely audible. Tears welled up in Isabel's eyes, tears of relief, of joy, of overwhelming love. Yes, Samuel, she said, her voice trembling. It's me. I'm here. He smiled faintly, a flicker of his old self returning. I knew you'd come, he whispered. He closed his eyes again, his breathing becoming more even, more peaceful. He had survived the night. He had fought his way back from the brink of death. Isabel knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, that Samuel's recovery would be slow and painful. But he was alive. He was with her. And that was all that mattered. The light grew stronger, illuminating the tent, chasing away the shadows. A new day had dawned, a day filled with hope, with promise, with the possibility of a future together. He had returned. And she was there, holding his hand, as the sun rose. Chapter 18. The Surgeon's Hands. Samuel's recovery was a long and arduous process, a testament to his resilience and Isabel's unwavering care. The shrapnel wounds, though extensive, gradually began to heal, but the head injury was more problematic, leaving him with lingering weakness, memory lapses, and bouts of debilitating headaches. The field hospital, overwhelmed with the constant influx of casualties, was not the ideal place for his convalescence. As soon as he was stable enough to be moved, Claire arranged for him to be transferred to a quieter, more specialized medical facility in a liberated town further from the front lines. Isabel accompanied him, her presence a constant source of comfort and support. She tended to his needs, monitored his progress, and advocated for his care, ensuring that he received the best possible treatment. She also spent hours talking to him, reading to him, and simply being with him, helping him to reconnect with the world and to regain his memory and cognitive function. The new hospital was a former convent, its peaceful atmosphere and spacious rooms a stark contrast to the chaotic field hospital. The medical staff were dedicated and skilled, and Samuel began to show slow but steady improvement. One of the doctors, a renowned surgeon named Dr. Dubois, a distant relative of Claire's, as it turned out took a particular interest in Samuel's case. He was a kind and compassionate man, with a reputation for performing miracles. He examined Samuel thoroughly, reviewing his medical records and conducting a series of tests. "The head injury is significant," Dr. Dubois said to Isabel, his voice grave but hopeful. "There's been some damage to the brain, but it's not irreversible. With time, patience, and the right therapy, he should make a good recovery." He recommended a course of specialized treatment, including physical therapy, occupational therapy, and cognitive rehabilitation. He also emphasized the importance of a supportive and stimulating environment, encouraging Isabel to continue her efforts to engage Samuel's mind and to help him reconnect with his past. Isabel threw herself into Samuel's rehabilitation, working closely with the therapists, learning the exercises and techniques, and incorporating them into their daily routine. She encouraged him to talk about his experiences, his memories, his feelings, helping him to piece together the fragments of his shattered past. It was a challenging and often frustrating process. Samuel struggled with his memory, his concentration, and his physical limitations. He had moments of despair, of frustration, of anger at his own body's betrayal. But Isabel was always there, her love and support unwavering, her patience inexhaustible. Slowly, gradually, Samuel began to improve. His memory became clearer, his concentration sharpened, and his physical strength returned. He started to walk without assistance, to engage in conversations, to remember details of his life before the war. One evening, as they were sitting together in the hospital garden, enjoying the warm sunshine, Samuel turned to Isabel, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and love. "I don't know how to thank you, Isabel," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You saved my life. You brought me back from the brink. You never gave up on me." Isabel smiled, her heart overflowing with love for him. "I promised I would wait for you," she said. "And I meant it. I made a vow, too," Samuel said, his voice firm. "A vow to return to you. And I intend to keep it." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His touch was warm and familiar, sending a shiver of electricity through her. "When this war is over," he said, his eyes locking with hers, "I want to marry you, Isabel. I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Tears welled up in Isabel's eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of overwhelming love. "Yes, Samuel," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." They embraced, their hearts filled with a profound sense of peace and happiness. The war had taken so much from them, but it had also given them something precious, a second chance at love, a future together, free from the shadows of the past. Dr. Dubois' gentle encouragement and the unwavering belief he, too, had placed in Samuel, had done wonders. She watched them play chess, in companionable quiet, and was glad of the surgeon's hands, on Samuel's recovery, and on her heart. And so, they began to plan their future, with a quiet but strong sense of happiness. Chapter 19. The Long Road Home. The war officially ended a few weeks later, the news greeted with a mixture of jubilation and profound relief. The world erupted in celebration, but for Isabel and Samuel, the victory was a more personal and intimate affair, a testament to their resilience, their love, and their unwavering commitment to each other. Samuel's recovery continued, his progress slow but steady. He still had lingering physical and cognitive challenges, but he was determined to overcome them, to rebuild his life, and to embrace the future with Isabel by his side. They decided to return to England, to Samuel's family home in a small village in the Cotswolds. It was a place of peace and tranquility, a world away from the horrors of the war, a place where they could heal, rebuild, and start their new life together. The journey home was long and arduous, but they faced it together, supporting each other, drawing strength from their shared love and their unwavering hope. They traveled by train and by ship, navigating the crowded and chaotic aftermath of the war, encountering countless others who were also seeking to return home, to rebuild their lives, to find peace. When they finally arrived at Samuel's family home, a charming, ivy-covered cottage nestled in the rolling hills of the Cotswolds, they were greeted with open arms by his family, who had been anxiously awaiting their return. They had received news of Samuel's injuries and had been praying for his recovery. The cottage was a haven of peace and tranquility, a place filled with warmth, love, and the comforting familiarity of home. The gardens were overgrown, the house in need of some repair, but it was perfect. It was a place where they could heal, rebuild, and start their new life together. Isabel quickly settled into the rhythm of village life, helping Samuel with his recovery, tending to the gardens, and getting to know his family and the local community. She found a sense of belonging, a sense of peace that she had not known since before the war. Samuel, too, began to find his place in this new world. He continued his rehabilitation, working with a local doctor and therapist, gradually regaining his strength and his cognitive function. He also began to explore new interests, finding solace in gardening, in reading, and in spending time with Isabel. They were married in the village church, a small, intimate ceremony attended by family and friends. It was a simple but beautiful affair, a celebration of their love, their resilience, and their unwavering commitment to each other. Isabel wore a simple white dress, and Samuel, though still leaning on a cane, stood tall and proud beside her, his eyes filled with love and gratitude. As they exchanged their vows, Isabel and Samuel knew that they had traveled a long and difficult road, that they had faced unimaginable challenges, but they had emerged stronger. Their love deepened, their bond unbreakable. The war had taken so much from them, but it had also given them something precious, a second chance at life, a future together, free from the shadows of the past. They were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, together, hand in hand, their hearts filled with hope and love. The road had been long and winding, and he was not completely healed. But as he looked down into her eyes, he smiled, for he knew he was home. The war had ended. Their life together had begun. The future awaited. They were finally where they were supposed to be, together. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Hearts. The years that followed were a testament to the enduring power of love and resilience. Isabel and Samuel settled into a quiet, contented life in the Cotswolds, their days filled with the simple joys of gardening, reading, and spending time together. The scars of the war, both physical and emotional, gradually faded, replaced by a sense of peace and fulfillment. Samuel's recovery, though never entirely complete, progressed steadily. He continued to experience occasional memory lapses and headaches, but he learned to manage his limitations, adapting to his new reality with grace and determination. He found work as a consultant for a local medical practice, using his knowledge and experience to help others, while also allowing him the flexibility to manage his health. Isabel, too, found fulfillment in her work. She volunteered at the village clinic, providing care to the local community, her skills honed by years of experience on the front lines. She also became involved in local charities, supporting veterans and their families, helping them to adjust to life after the war. They never forgot the sacrifices they had made, the dangers they had faced, the friends they had lost. They honored the memory of those who had fallen, and they remained grateful for the second chance they had been given. Claire, who had become a close friend, visited them often, sharing stories of her continued work and intelligence, now focused on rebuilding Europe and ensuring a lasting peace. She had found love herself, marrying a fellow resistance fighter and starting a family of her own. Thomas, who had betrayed them under torture, but had ultimately redeemed himself by providing crucial information that aided their escape, also remained in contact. He had been deeply scarred by his experiences, but he found solace in working with veterans, helping them to overcome their trauma and to rebuild their lives. He carried immense guilt, but Isabel and Samuel forgave him readily and easily. One sunny afternoon, as Isabel and Samuel were sitting together in their garden, enjoying the warmth of the sun and the beauty of the surrounding countryside, Samuel turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and reflection. "You know, Isabel," he said, "I used to think that my work as a spy, as Nightingale, was the most important thing in my life. I thought that I was making a difference, that I was saving lives." Isabel nodded, understanding his feelings. "You were, Samuel," she said. "You did save lives. You made a difference. But I was wrong," he continued. "The most important thing in my life wasn't my work, it was you. It was our love. It was the hope of a future together that kept me going, that gave me the strength to face the dangers, to endure the hardships." Isabel smiled, her heart overflowing with love for him. "And you, Samuel," she said, "you were my light in the darkness. You were the reason I kept fighting, the reason I never gave up hope." They embraced, their hearts filled with a profound sense of gratitude and contentment. They had faced the horrors of war, the pain of separation, the uncertainty of the future, but they had emerged stronger, their love deepened, their bond unbreakable. They had learned that the true reckoning of hearts was not found in grand gestures or heroic deeds, but in the small, everyday moments of love, of kindness, of connection. It was found in the shared laughter, the whispered secrets, the comforting presence of another soul. They had built a life together, a life filled with peace, with purpose, with love. They had found their happily ever after, not in a fairy tale ending, but in the quiet, enduring reality of their shared journey. Their life was their reckoning, and their hearts, finally, after all the trials, were at peace. Epilogue. Years turned into decades, and the seasons continued their timeless cycle. Isabel and Samuel lived a long and full life together in their Cotswolds cottage, their love a constant beacon, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. The garden they had nurtured together bloomed year after year, a vibrant tapestry of colors and fragrances, a reflection of the beauty and resilience they had cultivated in their own lives. Samuel's health, though never fully restored to what it had been before the war, remained stable. He continued his consulting work, his expertise valued by the local community, his gentle wisdom a source of comfort and guidance. Isabel, too, remained active, her nursing skills still in demand, her compassionate heart a source of solace to those in need. They often walked hand in hand through the village and the surrounding countryside, their steps slower now, their bodies bearing the marks of time, but their love as strong and vibrant as ever. They would pause by the village church, where they had exchanged their vows so many years ago, and remember the day they had committed their lives to each other, a commitment that had weathered the storms of war and the passage of time. They cherished the visits of Claire and her family, sharing stories, laughter, and the quiet joy of friendship. They also kept in touch with Thomas, who had found peace and purpose in his work with veterans, his guilt gradually fading, replaced by a sense of redemption and gratitude. As they grew older, Isabel and Samuel spent more time reflecting on their past, on the extraordinary experiences they had shared, on the love that had sustained them through it all. They had witnessed the horrors of war, the depths of human cruelty, but they had also seen the best of humanity, the courage, the compassion, the resilience of the human spirit. One evening, as they sat together by the fireplace, the flames casting a warm glow on their faces, Samuel turned to Isabel, his eyes filled with a love that had only deepened with time. "We were lucky, Isabel," he said, his voice soft and gentle. "We found each other, and we survived. We built a life together, a good life. Isabel nodded, her heart overflowing with gratitude.
She said.
We were blessed. They held each other close, their hearts filled with a profound sense of peace and contentment. They had lived a life full of love, of purpose, of meaning. They had faced the darkness and found the light. They had endured the storms and found their safe harbor. In the quiet stillness of the evening, surrounded by the warmth of their home and the enduring power of their love, they knew that they had lived a life well lived, a life that had made a difference, a life that would be remembered. And as the embers glowed and the night grew quiet, they both knew they would always have each